All right, welcome everyone to Harlem Speaks, the flagship series of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. My name is Greg Thomas. I'm co-producer of Harlem Speaks. And on behalf of Loren Schoenberg, Executive Director, and Christian McBride, Co-Executive Director, and the board and staff of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, I welcome you to our discussion tonight with the one and only Farah Jasmine Griffin, Columbia University professor, author, writer, thinker, beautiful sister, and give her a hand.
Thank you.
All right, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too.
Yeah.
Okay, so we usually start at the beginning. Tell us when and where you were born.
Okay, when? Do I have to tell you when?
You don't have to tell. You don't.
I don't mind.
Okay.
So I was born in Philadelphia in the early 1960s.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, early 1960s. In Philly.
In Philly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And did you grow up in Philly?
I grew up in Philly. Left there when I was 18 to go to college, but my formative years were all in Philadelphia. Yeah.
Okay. Well, tell us about your family.
Let's see, where do I start? My grandparents were both migrants from Georgia. My grandmother's from central Georgia, Eastman, and my grandfather, I know less about where he was from. These are my maternal grandparents, was from the Sea Islands, but I don't know which one.
Okay.
And then my father's parents were also from Georgia, so both groups were migrants.
Wow.
They ended up in South Philadelphia. You know Philly.
Right.
You know that South Philly is where the kind of historical black community was before people moved into North Philly and West Philly. So both parents were actually born in Philadelphia and met as kids, married as teenagers. And I had one sister who has since passed, but she was 21 years older than me.
Wow.
And so we always used to say that we had the same biological parents, but very different parents. They were different people who raised us. Grew up in a jazz-loving household. And, just one sibling, but I think both of us also had the experience of being only children because we didn't grow up in the house together.
Right.
And a bunch of cousins and a large Philly-based family, small nuclear family, but large extended family.
Okay. So what was it like growing up in Philly?
Philly was an incredible place to grow up. It's got that old history, and it's very dedicated to its history. I think places like Boston are similar. Like New York tears things down and is really about the new so much, and you look for history, it's still here. But Philadelphia is, the Liberty Bell and all of that stuff. It also has a really strong jazz history, strong black music history, really. And when I was growing up, it was a place that was very political, very much a part of the involved and engaged in the civil rights and Black Power movement, Black arts movement, and then became less so as I got older. So I traced my sort of political sensibilities to, as early on, my introduction to a certain political way of seeing the world, along with my introduction to the music. They sort of went hand in hand in a place like Philadelphia.
Okay. So, excuse me, I'm sorry. All right, so early 60s. So in the 70s, these are formative years. So can you give us some type of instance or anecdote that combines the political and the musical for you early on?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, I think, it's funny because I wasn't really, like I said, I grew up in a household where jazz was primary, and I didn't really, to me, popular music was more associated with my larger extended family.
Okay.
Right? But I specifically remember my father introducing me to Abbey Lincoln and Max Roach and going to see Nothing But a Man as a little girl when there was a film festival there in Philly. And so being introduced to, things like the Freedom Now Suite very early. But the most explicit kind of earliest memory I have of a connection between politics and music wasn't jazz focused. It was Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On."
Okay.
My family had a little. We used to call it the restaurant, but it really wasn't a restaurant. It was a counter, and you know those little red vinyl stools that spin around, and very interesting place. But there was a jukebox there,
Okay.
and so we would always get the newest music. And so I just remember thinking, hearing, you know, having heard Marvin Gaye with my cousins and everything, but hearing that particular song when it came on, that it really connected to what was going on outside, you know, the kind of discussions around the family table about Vietnam or about what was going on, or even about the environment, right? That's my first explicit notion of connecting music and politics. And then it was also a time with the emergence of the sound of Philadelphia, and the different artists who would come in and out of Philly, the music that was being made there, and some of that was kind of explicitly related to politics as well.
Okay. Now, often guests have said how, particularly older guests, how back in the 40s, 50s, I mean, you did have genres, but it was really something that the music industry and the record industry, in terms of boxing the genres for the sake of record sales. Now, we know that you go back to race records, and they were doing that, yes.
Right.
But it seems that it really accelerated. Now, in your experience early on, not in terms of records and the radio, but in terms of the music that you heard at home, the music in the neighborhood, maybe the music that you went to hear, was there this separation, or did you, or did people dig all kinds of music?
Yeah, people listen to all kinds of music, and it was just, I mean, what it was sort of presented as our music. This is the music of our people.
Right.
But you know, you made distinctions, but I don't think they were genre distinctions. Like, I made distinctions based on who in my family listened to that kind of music. So, like, you know, my daddy was you know, he loved all jazz, right? But, you know, he loved Miles, and he loved Train, and he grew up down the street from Jimmy Heath. I mean, so he's of that generation. And my mother liked everything, you know, and I had one aunt who really loved the blues, right? She really, and so I associated, there's certain kind of blues sounds, particularly like urban blues, that I not only associate with her, but I associate with the kind of food she cooked. You know, what I ate at her house when I listened to this kind of music. And another aunt who was really kind of avant-garde and listened to, you know, it was at her house where I just got exposed to all different kinds of music, everything from, she loved LaBelle, she loved Miles, but unlike, Mommy didn't like Electric Miles, Aunt Eunice liked Electric Miles. The first time I saw the cover of Bitches Brew was at her house, right, or On the Corner, that's the one I remember seeing at her house. And my cousins and my sister, you know, they liked to dance, and they liked Motown, and so, you know, it was all music to be heard at a family gathering that wasn't so much separated in terms of genre, but just in terms of who liked it, who played it. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that your cousins like to dance. Did you like to dance?
You know, this is so interesting.
Because you put a separation, you said they like to dance.
Well, they were older.
Okay.
They were older, although I had a different, let's see, this is getting me into a long story.
And by the way, I want you to go there, but I do want to hear the names, you know, of these various folks, because we recorded, we archived.
Sure.
You know?
So, how can I say this? My father, whose name was Emerson Griffin, was a great dancer. He's just a very talented man across the board, self-taught in many ways. And I think that there was a version of him that was known for, you know, dancing. I mean, both tap dancing and popular dance and everything. By the time I came along, that's not who he was. By the time I came along, he had gone through a stint in the Nation of Islam, like maybe a year or two, and had a very different relationship to like popular culture and dance. So I did not grow up seeing him like my sister did. My sister, for instance, who was a great dancer, to her that was something she inherited from Daddy. I did not. So
Wow.
I associated dance with my cousins, my older cousins who I worshipped and, you know, had crushes on all their friends and
Right.
everything. But it wasn't, I don't think I learned to love to dance until I was older.
Wow.
Yeah, like as a teenager. But I wasn't one of those little babies who, you know, in our community, the baby kind of squats 3 times and people say, oh, get it, baby. Right? That wasn't me.
Okay, okay.
So yeah, I had a different, it took me longer to enter into that culture.
Did you ever see your dad get down?
No, I saw him do what we call tap dance. You know, he would show me every once in a while. He would do that, and everybody in his family danced like that. They were incredible, and so he showed me that, and he tried to teach me, and I had 2 left feet. I saw my mother dance. My mother, and she would dance with my. Actually, I don't think I ever saw the 2 of them dance together. I would see her dance with her cousins and her nephews and friends and things like that.
What was her
She
name?
loved to dance. My mother's name is
Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
Wilhelmina Griffin, but everybody calls her Mina.
Okay.
Mina. Hmm.
All right. So you mentioned various kinds of music.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of jazz,
Mm-hmm.
what caught you earliest? What really grabbed you?
Yeah. 2 things, and I think that they're actually related, but I didn't know it at the time. So any vocalist, the first vocalist I ever remember hearing was Gloria Lynn.
Ah.
And I can see the album, and it was the album that was
I Wish You Love is on it?
yeah, Fly Me to the Moon is on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that the one where she's wearing this beige or white form-fitting?
You know what? It's not the album cover that I can see. It's literally the album.
Oh,
Like, you know
okay.
how the albums used to have
Yeah.
those paper things on
Right.
them? So I can see that.
Oh, okay.
And the one, In This World of Ordinary People, Extraordinary People, I'm Glad There's You. So those are that's the first thing I remember just being captured by,
Because that
captivated by.
I think that was like the late 50s, right?
Yeah, so my parents probably had it in the house.
Uh-huh.
And I loved her so much. And I had a cat. You know, I grew up with cats. I love cats. And my very first cat I named Gloria, after Gloria Lynn, even though it was a male cat. So Gloria Lynn, voice I remember hearing first. And Miles Davis, immediately. There was something about Miles, and I remember those albums too because they had the red and the black Columbia
Right.
label. So Miles Davis's voice, those are the 2 voices I remember. And it was later on, I remember hearing Billie Holiday, but I didn't really start being sort of captured by that until a little bit later on.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, as a little girl, before I can remember almost anything, I remember Gloria Lynn and Miles Davis.
Okay. Now, you're a professor of literature, African American studies.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now let's go on the literary side.
Okay.
Were you a voracious reader as a youngster?
Yes, absolutely.
Not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
And did you read Nancy Drew and all of that
Yeah,
stuff?
I read all of that stuff. You know, I grew up in a house with a lot of books, and I got my first library card when I was 3.
All right.
My father got me a library card. I remember the first 2 books that were my favorite books. One was just recently republished. I gave it to my mother as a surprise. It was called Anne Loves Red. It was about red, see? It's about a little girl who loved red. And I gave it to my mother recently. It was republished. And I said, oh, you know, I never thought I'd find this book again. It was a little easy reader that you buy in a supermarket, you know.
Right.
And she said, you know, she finally told me, she said, you know, that book disappeared. She said, that book disappeared. And I said, why did it disappear? And she said, because you drove us crazy about, you know, so that was, Anne Loves Red was one of the first books. And then later on, Nancy Drew and.
Wait now. You said
Yeah.
you remember your first 2. What was the second?
A book called The Lonely Doll. Yeah, The Lonely Doll. Yeah, which is it's one of those books that it was a book of photographs, a doll, and she was an only child, like I thought I was,
Mm-hmm.
and and she was visited by Mr. Bear and his son, right? So, and that was recently republished too. So those are my two first books. But then poetry was really important too, because I was coming up during a time when there were a lot of black arts poetry being performed
Right.
everywhere, and I would try to memorize Nikki Giovanni, and I mean, I had this sense that it's interesting. I had this sense that poetry was something black women did, because there was Sonia Sanchez, right, and Nikki Giovanni, and so and that maybe one day I could do that thing called poetry. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So, elementary school, junior high school. Let's start like a junior high school. That would have been
Like the 70s.
mid 70s. So, did they have music programs in the schools? Were you involved in any of that?
Yeah, I was. So my father really wanted me to. He really wanted me to play an instrument, and so he taught me how to read music as a little girl, and then bought me a keyboard. And so by the time I got to junior high, and my dad died when I was very young. He died before I got to junior high. My mother, was like, well, your daddy wanted you to play an instrument, and she decided that she thought she picked the instrument for me, that it should be the flute because it was ladylike and pretty, and she probably wanted to play it herself. So I started playing the flute in junior high. I was in the junior high band. I wasn't very good, and by that time I had already been bitten by the writing bug. And it was kind of what kept me up at night with the light on was reading and writing. But I did play the flute. I wasn't good. I played in the band, and I actually even got to have I never had I remember the spring concert at our junior high school. I played a duet, flute and clarinet, I think it was, duet. So, and then I actually stopped playing the flute when I went to high school, but all through junior high I played it.
What was the name of the junior high school?
So it was interesting. It was more like a middle school. It's a magnet school. I left my neighborhood school in 3rd grade, McDaniel, and in 4th grade, from 4th grade to 9th grade, I went to a school called the J.R. Masterman Laboratory and Demonstration School. It's a public school, but I had to take 2 buses to get there, and so I went there until I was 14.
Okay. All right. And would that be similar to some of the specialized schools that they have today in New York?
It was definitely, it was a, I think the word was overused, but it was a school for gifted and talented children.
Right.
And they came from all over the city.
Did they call it SP?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
That was down south. They called it SP. Okay.
So we came from all over the city. It was really good because it just exposed me to diversity. And I grew up in South Philly. The street that I grew up on was literally the borderline between Black South Philly and Italian South Philly. And I remember going to Masterman and realizing that the people I grew up thinking of as white were not white like the white people who I met at school, that they were Italian, and there was a difference. And so Masterman had all kinds of people,
Right.
very predominantly African American, but all kinds of people because it was such a good public school.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then high school.
So in high school, I got a scholarship to go to a girls' school in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, right across from Bryn Mawr College, called the Baldwin School for Girls, and I went there for 3 years of high school.
Okay. And what are your fondest memories?
Of that school?
Yeah.
Oh, I have lots of fond memories of that school. Just the way that a kind of love of learning was encouraged,
Okay.
and exposure to art and literature, and I made good friends there. And I think, just the ways that girls were taken seriously, that their intellectual lives were taken seriously, are probably my fondest memories. I had very good teachers. The teachers were, many of the girls were very wealthy. The teachers were not. And the teachers were actually more progressive politically than the families who sent, many of the families who sent their children there. So they were pretty, for the most part, they were pretty extraordinary people. So I have, you know, but my fondest memories aren't so much of the school. I mean, I have very fond memories of the school, but some of my fondest memories are of like the ways that my community supported me when I went there. Like I used to have to take a commuter train to school, and the conductors, you know, would, first of all, the ladies on the train were like my other mothers. They were going out to work in these wealthy houses, and they'd look out for me, and the conductors would collect tickets from and give me like a third of them. So I feel like they gave me a transportation scholarship because it was very expensive. You know, my mother couldn't afford that. So they would give me they'd collect a little pile of tickets, and then when I would get off, they would just hand them to me. Yeah, so that's I have a lot of those kind of memories, and like getting on the bus early in the morning and it's dark, and the women on the buses looking out for me, and coming home late at night and it's dark, you know, and just so you know, the memories are both of what happened in school, but also kind of all this stuff surrounding school.
So there was no dormitory?
No, it was not a boarding school. My mother would not have let me go to this. I got a better chance scholarship, and my mother was very much, she was not going to let me go to a boarding school. Baldwin had been a boarding school, but it had become a day school.
Okay.
So I commuted every day.
How long was the commute?
Probably about an hour both ways. Yeah, a bus and then a train, both ways.
Okay. So I take it that you further enriched your love of writing and of literature there?
I learned how to write there. I mean, like, you know, I always thought that, and this is what I tell my students, you know, that writing was just something mysterious that you were born into. And I do think you're born with a certain kind of literary talent. I mean, that's true. But I also think that writing is a skill. And a lot of times people don't get taught the skill. And so I was taught the skill of writing there. And I also, you know, the love of reading and literature that I had was nurtured. And it's interesting because, you know, I read stuff that I would later read again in college, and we read all the classics. We did not read any literature by black writers. Everything that I read by black writers, I read on my own outside of school. So I got this really good kind of training in Western literature, but my home training, literally my home training, what my parents gave me and also what I read on my own was by black writers. But when I graduated, I remember my English teacher, who I adored, giving me, some of you will remember this, Toni Morrison was on the cover of Newsweek in 1981. And she gave me that copy of Newsweek, you know, because she knew that by then I was reading Toni Morrison and loving her. So they were supportive, but the curriculum was conservative.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in terms of your own studying, your own reading, who were some of the people you were reading back then on your own?
Yeah, wow. Well, like I said, I loved poetry, so I was reading, you know, I started reading Langston Hughes, and I remember reading Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. And then I remembered, and Toni Morrison, Bluest Eye. Sula was this book that went around, like, so we would have, you know, when you grow up in the city and you don't have a lot of money, you play out in the street. And but every once in a while a book would enter and we'd pass the book around. And usually they were really trashy books because you just wanted to read about the sex parts. But sometimes they would also be really good books.
No, that's not true.
It's
We
so
didn't do
true.
that. We didn't do that.
And I remember so many of those kind of books. Like, that's how I read Iceberg Slim and all of those books.
Oh, you read that too?
I read that too.
Okay, yeah,
but then,
me too.
like, Black Boy would come in there, you know, and then I remember Sula coming, and people they were like, what is this, you know? And we literally, it would be one book that we'd pass around, and then we'd go off and jump double dutch or whatever. So, I started.
So you mean that you don't mean that like you'd be in a group reading it. You mean that one person would read it.
One person would read it, and then she'd give it to
Right.
somebody else, and somebody would say, I don't understand that book, and I don't like that one. Or Howard Street, I don't know if you know that book. Howard Street was one of those books, and so I should make a syllabus of the books that I read in that way. And I remember Black Boy was one of them because somebody had read Black Boy in school and shared it with us. And then, you know, but there are certain books that I remember reading. There's like a ritual. So, some of the women in the audience will understand this. So I am in the kitchen getting my hair straightened. It's a very special time. My mother, and that would be a time when, in addition to talking to her, I'd read. And I literally remember reading James Baldwin then. And I remember reading, in school we were reading Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Right. And I remember reading at home at the same time Go Tell It on the Mountain and thinking, these two books are related. Like, two things I remember about this book, that both of them are about young artists or young people, right? And then the other one that I remembered about James Baldwin, about Go Tell It on the Mountain, that it was also about migration, Black people who came from the South to the North, and that was my family's story. So, but it was, I remember reading it while I was getting my hair straightened, and probably listening to Gladys Knight on the radio at the same time.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you answered one question. I was going to ask you about, you know, specific books that you remember during that period. And by the way, since we rarely get a chance to talk about hair straightening. So, did she use the old iron, or she
used that little old straightening comb,
okay.
because it was a big deal. Because, like I said, so my father was nationalist,
right.
And there was no hair straightening. He wasn't having that. But you know, you get to be a certain age and peer pressure and everything, and so I really wanted it. And so the aunts all came together, and they bought all the stuff that one needed to do this. You know, it's a ritual. And so she used the old-fashioned straightening comb. You know, no perms, no chemicals.
Okay. Okay, all right. It's on record.
That's right. I will I will admit to it. Yes.
Okay. All right, so how many colleges did you apply to? Just generally, you know, if you don't remember exactly.
Oh, I know exactly how many colleges.
Oh, you do?
I
Okay.
applied to. 6.
Okay. Was Harvard your number one choice?
It became my number one choice. Yeah, it was my number one choice at first was University of Pennsylvania.
Your Penn.
It was a good school. I had spent summers on the campus doing different programs, and then I had, again, this was, you know, the counselors at Baldwin said you should apply to Harvard, and then I spent one summer at Penn's campus with a group of young people, Black and Latino students, and they were applying to places like Harvard, and they were like, you should do this. And I really hadn't thought about it, but then one of the people who was our professor, whose name is escaping me right now, but it will come back to me, Dr. Whitney, who was a professor at the Wharton School, and this program we were in was to introduce young Black and Latino students to business. And I told him that I was thinking about I was going to apply to Penn, and maybe I would apply to Wharton. And he said, you know, you love to read and write so much. Why would you apply to Wharton? Now he was going against his job. His job was to recruit us for Wharton. And he said, I really think you would like Harvard. And so he said, you should go visit. And at this point, it was just, you know, Mom and me. And so economically, that was not an option for me, like these college tours that people do. Right. And I wasn't in a program that would do them for me. And so I said, well, you know, I don't know. And I remember he gave me the money and it was to buy a round trip train ticket. And I went to visit, and I had a friend who was there who I'd met. She'd gotten a scholarship to another school, and she and I used to get the same bus out of our neighborhood in the mornings, and she'd gone to Harvard. I remember my mother made her graduation dress. My mother was seamstress. And so I went, and I came out the subway, and it was still the kind of old, funky Harvard Square. And I was like, oh yeah, it wasn't even about Harvard. It was about Harvard Square, you know, with the street musicians and the people handing out political stuff. And I thought, this is it. I mean, I think if I had really thought about schools, I probably wouldn't have picked Harvard. But it was Harvard Square.
Look at that.
Yeah, so it became my first choice.
Okay. All right, so you applied, got in. Because you've mentioned this a couple of times, I mean, did you get a bunch of scholarships? Okay,
Yep.
all right. And your major was what?
I majored in, there's a major there called History and Literature. And there are these small majors at Harvard that they're interdisciplinary majors, and you have to write a thesis in them. But I chose it just because I've always been intellectually kind of schizophrenic, and I could never decide which one. So when I found out there was a major where I could do both, I was like, that's for me. So that
Okay.
was my major.
All right, so obviously there's certain required courses and then certain electives.
Right.
Describe how you ended up choosing what became your concentration as an undergraduate.
Yeah, so there were these required courses, and I'd had this really good background coming from Baldwin, particularly in the literature and in European literature especially, a very strong background in that. But when I got to Harvard, Harvard was also beginning an African American Studies program. Well, they'd already had it, but Nathan Huggins had taken it over, and I took a class with him, and just, it was the first time in my life that I could actually formally study stuff about black people and get credit for it.
He was a
And so
historian.
He was a historian.
Right.
And then there was a German professor who had actually taught at Columbia but came to Harvard. He was a Baraka scholar. He'd written a beautiful book on
What's his
Baraka.
name?
His name is Werner Solers.
Right.
And I took his class, and then it was like I was in love. I mean, I just, it was literature, but it was, I started with Phyllis Wheatley, and we read through, the 20th century stuff I knew I'd read on my own, but I'd never studied it formally. And so I just, it was like a calling. All of a sudden, this is what, although becoming a professor wasn't a calling at the time, I thought I would become a writer.
Okay.
That's what I planned to do. So I did American history and literature, but with a concentration in Africa. At that time, it was mostly African American and some Caribbean, but mostly African American.
Okay. And so by the time you're a junior, senior, I mean, you have to write a thesis. What was your thesis on?
My thesis was on a 19th century woman who was an activist and abolitionist and poet named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And she's fairly well known now. There's a lot of stuff on her. But when I started studying her, I'd read the history books, and she'd be in the history books as this major abolitionist. And then I read the literature books, and they'd say she was this first black woman to write a novel. And they wouldn't even, they never said it was the same person.
Right.
Right. So that's what I wrote my thesis on.
Okay. Now, music. What was the music scene like at Harvard and in the surrounding area?
Yeah, there was a lot of music in the surrounding areas, without question. Like, there was a jazz scene, there was a folk music scene. Tracy Chapman used to sing in the subway. She was a student at Tufts at the time. Joshua Redmond was behind me, so he wasn't there yet, but Don Braden was in my class. I remember the day, Don Braden was in my class, and I remember the day I saw him in the bank, and he said, "I'm leaving school." And he was smart. He was like a math, computer science guy. He's the first person that sent me the equivalent of a instant message on an old-fashioned computer. Like, I was sitting in a computer lab, and there's this message from Don Braden. Like,
By the way,
genius.
for those of you who don't know, Don Braden's an excellent tenor saxophonist.
Tenor saxophonist.
Yeah.
So we're in the bank, and he tells me, "I'm leaving school. I'm going to play with Wynton." I remember that. So Don Braden was there. There were other jazz lovers. Fred Moten, who's now a well-known poet and theorist, was very much into the music. Earl Lewis, who some of you might know, he has a show on New York One now, and also is New York Daily News columnist. He was there, loved jazz.
Formerly Daily News. He was there at the same time?
Yeah, he and Fred were a year ahead of me.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. I didn't know
So
that.
there was a lot of, not so much I wasn't aware of music on Harvard's campus so much as I was in the city and the surrounding area.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Fred, I was going to say for the record, Fred was a professor of mine at NYU.
Yeah.
I love Fred
Yeah.
Moten.
Beautiful person.
Yes,
He was beautiful
definitely.
then too. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. All right. So after, I mean, at what point did you, okay, you wanted to be a writer at first. You're at Harvard. When you get to that point where you're a junior and you've got to think about your next steps while you're in senior, did you think about automatically graduate school, or did you say, well, maybe I'll work for a year, or what did you do?
I thought I was going to go to law school because that's what you did if you majored in literature.
Right.
And I came from a working poor family, and so the idea of not doing something to make money, just not to make enough money to help my family, was not an option.
Right.
So, and I'd also in high school worked for Judge A. Leon Higginbotham. So I just thought I'd go to law school, and it was my professors who said you should think about graduate school. And but yeah, I was on my way, LSATs, all of that, on my way to law school. Yeah.
And what happened?
I thought, one, that I was going to be really miserable if I had become a lawyer, that I wasn't going to become the kind of lawyer who made a whole lot of money. I probably would have done public interest law or something. I wouldn't have made a lot of money as a lawyer. And graduate school seemed to be a compromise between being a professional and pursuing this Jones I have for writing. It seemed to be something in the middle. And I just, I didn't really know. I didn't know what graduate school was. Like, my dad had gone to Temple. He got an associate's degree from Temple. But I didn't come from a family of people who went to college. So I had no idea that people got PhDs to teach. I mean, I learned that from Professor Huggins. So it was just, it was kind of a whole new world to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you went to graduate school where?
I went to Yale.
Went to Yale. American Studies?
American Studies.
Was let me see, this would have been
It was like 86.
86. So Henry Louis Gates was still there?
He just left.
Just left.
He-
He went to Duke.
Yeah, he really made his mark. Charles Davis had been there. Henry Louis Gates had just left. John Blassingame was there. Cornel West was there. Bell Hooks was there. And it was just a completely different world from Harvard, much less conservative. All these kind of young African-American intellectuals, just really a good time to be there.
And how long were you there for?
I was in New Haven for 3 years, and then I left New Haven, and it took me another 3 years to finish the degree. But I was in New Haven for 3 years.
Okay. So was it a master's that you got?
I never did the master's. I
Wait.
just went straight through. I was afraid. I had this feeling that if I stopped at the master's, I wouldn't do it because it just wasn't, there was enough that made it unattractive and unappealing that if I got the master's, I was going to say, see you. So I never even though officially I got a master's, I never went to pick it up because I knew that I just didn't want to know that I could end there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And at Yale, I mean, who were some of your favorite professors?
John Blassingame, the historian. Cornell blew my mind. To see a professor that brilliant, who was also black and loved black people and loved music. And I remember one of the first times I was talking to him, and I said, I was talking about something, and I said, somebody's from Buffalo. And he said, Buffalo? He said, that's where Rick James is from. I remember thinking, wow, okay. You can still be smart and still be connected to people in this way. So, I learned a lot from him. There's a professor named Sylvia Arden Boone, who was an African art historian. She has since died, but she was just this model of just excellence, just excellence. And she'd had a fascinating life. She'd been an expatriate in Ghana. So Dwight Andrews, who was there as a graduate student, but he was so far advanced that he felt like our professor.
Wow.
And he was in the music department, but he was also like the music director for August Wilson, and he was playing all of August Wilson's plays, and he was making all of these beautiful jazz CDs. I mean, he's just, you know, so to say he wasn't a classmate, he was above all of us.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And now he's in Atlanta.
He's at
He's
Emory.
a minister.
He's a minister and a professor and a
Right.
working musician.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So is it true that your PhD dissertation did your PhD dissertation become your first
Became
book?
my first book. Right.
Which is
Who Set You
You to Flowing?
Mhm.
Okay. Let me just say, when I met Professor Griffin, Farah, I was a member of the jazz study group at Columbia University while I was doing graduate work at NYU. And I gave a presentation on John Hendricks, and I actually ended the presentation by riffing. I don't know if you remember that, riffing on your book. You remember that? So tell us about that book.
Yeah. So Who Set You Flowing basically looks at it's, you know, I think all scholarship is really autobiographical in a way. So even though it doesn't say I in it, and it's very objective and scholarly. If you remember, I was talking about my family migrating from Georgia and getting my hair straightened and reading the books about migration. So that book looks at the way black artists, musicians, writers, anonymous black people created art out of their experience of migrating to the North. So it looks at literature, music, painting, all these different art forms, and says that the central experience for black people in our art forms in the mid-20th century was this experience of migrating from the South. Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's come to today. There's a book that came out fairly recently.
The Warmth of Other Suns, right?
Right.
Isabel Wilkerson, I think is her name.
I think so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that particular book? I mean,
I'm glad it's out there. I mean, it's a beautiful book. I'm reading it now. She's an extraordinary writer, and it's always funny to me because the way that they talk about it on the radio and in the press is like, this is the story that's never been told, the story of migration that's never been. I'm like, people told that story since Paul Laurence Dunbar in 1901. I mean, black people have been telling that story forever, but because nobody except us listened, then it's never been told, you know. So that's frustrating to me. But when I know all these writers who wrote about that, I mean, Ellison writes about it, but and people talk about it in their lives, but that's not to take away from the achievement, from her achievement, which is really quite extraordinary.
okay. You mentioned Ellison. I'm glad you did. Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man, Shadow and Act, Going to the Territory. When did you first confront Ellison?
So I tried to read Invisible Man on my own in high school, tried to work my way through it. And then I read it again in college.
So when you say you tried,
Yeah.
it wasn't successful at first?
I mean, I read it, but I knew that there was just stuff that I wasn't getting,
Okay.
that I didn't understand. You know,
Right.
I knew that. But a lot of times that still happens with me with books. I don't understand them, but the language is so seductive. And I just love the language so much. I like living in that world that I keep reading, you know, and hope that I get it.
Right.
And then I studied it again in college, and I read it many times before I even felt adequately equipped to teach it. Like I'd read it a lot before I would actually teach it.
Okay. Because there was a documentary on Ellison that Farah was in and commented on. What would you say, because Ellison is key for his writing, but Ellison was also key for the way he dealt with music,
Right.
jazz in particular.
Right.
So what would you say about Ellison's contribution?
Oh, it's major, you know, and I don't think that I would have had the courage to even write about music had I not read Ellison and Baraka. And even though they were oppositional and opposing, I consider myself a daughter of both of them, and so intellectually. So, but his contribution just to, you know, to understanding this art form, to the centrality of it, not just to black people, but to America, to our very kind of identities as Americans. And the ways that he you know, on the one hand, there are the essays that he wrote about it, which are classic and you have to read them. On the other hand, it's the way he works the music through his fiction, and the music is also, in some ways, a form, you know, a model of a form for his fiction. So I think that he is probably the kind of major 20th century, one of the major 20th century writers about this music.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned Baraka.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you get from Baraka, Amiri Baraka?
Courage. I got a lot from Baraka. I think that, you know, the being able to think about the music I grew up loving and listening to in relation to my people's history and their experience here, and you know how to think about it that way. And I also got, I think that he's incredibly courageous. He's not always right, but he's courageous.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, what I also got from him was, and this takes courage, I think, the willingness to change, to say, I used to think this, and I don't think this anymore, right? I used to think this way, and now I think this way. And to take the same thing, you know, I used to think this about this piece of writing or about this human being, and I don't think that anymore, because there's a way that once you write it down, people often want to keep you in that sentence that you wrote 20 years ago.
Right.
And his just willingness to rethink and change, you know, I think I've learned a lot. I admire that a lot.
Okay. And one other writer I'd like you to speak about, who also intersects literature and music, blues, jazz, Albert Murray. What would you say about Albert Murray?
Again, you know, just another one of those towering figures who, again, like Baraka and like Ellison, I think really bring together the kind of aesthetics of music and the aesthetics of writing. And for me, the most influential of Albert Murray's books was Stomping the Blues. Just beautifully written and providing a kind of sophisticated way to think about not just, you know, the music, but the context in which it's produced and performed. Yeah, and linking that, what I also like, and Ellison does this too, but linking that with these other forms of Western art and music, you know, and you know, I think because of my experience learning the kind of Western literary canon, I'm also always thinking about how these writers, they know it too, and they're responding to that as well, and Murray points that out in a number of ways.
You had mentioned Baldwin earlier. I mean, all the people we've mentioned, they knew the Western canon, the European canon, Euro-American canon. When you were reading them, were you surprised, or what was it like reading them and resonating with stuff that you had read? I mean, did it just highlight their brilliance even more?
Yeah, I think that you know, I came to them with a certain set of expectations. I don't know that our children have those expectations anymore, but I came to them almost expecting that they did that, like, because I had been raised to believe that, well, you know, like, I had been raised to believe in a certain kind of black excellence, that, you know, my father and mother were like, whatever we do well. You know, we don't leave any stone uncovered, and if we are insane, we do that well. You know, and we do it with style. Right. And so I came to these writers like, yeah, of course they've read this stuff. They wouldn't do this without reading it, you know. So it was just this expectation that that's what we do, and we do it well. We do it beautifully, you know, and whether it's playing basketball or anything. Like I coined this new phrase with my husband the other night. I told him, I said, black people are just mo extra. And he said, what do you mean by that? I said, well, you know, like certain things are extra, right? But black people just do it mo extra, right? So it was like a facility with the Western canon. Yeah, I expected that. Just like I expected, you know, that the music would be at its peak, kind of, and always engaging the world around it. So I wasn't surprised by that.
Okay,
you know?
That's good. We only have a few minutes left for this particular tape, but I do want to ask you, because this is a very important work and figure in the field that you're in, and I just want you to talk about it, because we often don't get a chance to talk about this. I think when Bob O'Mealy was here, we were able to get into certain things. Henry Louis Gates is the signifying monkey. Can you talk about that work and its importance in the context of what we were just talking about?
Yeah. Well, you know, we have this whole tradition of kind of black literary criticism that doesn't really get talked about that much for some of the same reasons that we talked about migration. People have been telling these stories and working through these issues for a long time, and then there's a moment when the broader public seems to be interested, and so a lot of attention is given. Right. And so I think that Signifying Monkey came along during a time when something very interesting was happening. Black literature was starting to get legitimated in the mainstream white academy.
And by the way, it came out when, about 85?
It came out like 80, no, it was
earlier?
Like 87, 86, 87,
okay.
Yeah. And so what he did, and he along with Houston Baker, they were, they had been kind of oppositional to each other, but then what they did together was both look at all the changes that were being brought in the study of literature from kind of these European theories of language, post-structuralist theories of language, and then try to find ways of talking about our literature that both spoke to those European theories, but that drew from their own vernacular traditions. So for Baker, it was the blues, right? And for Gates, it was this notion of signification that, and where he said black texts, black writers signified on the Western tradition and also signified on each other, and in responding to each other created their own tradition. Right. And he liked the signifying monkey because he could also make it a diasporic figure. He could connect our signifying monkey with Eshu and these other kind of Yoruba-based figures and their facility with language.
The folk, Brer Rabbit.
Right.
Okay, because what brought that up for me was your Mo Extra.
Yeah.
So his is like the signifying difference, and you're talking about Mo Extra.
Yeah, except I'm not going to write a book about the Mo Extra.
You're not going to do that?
No, that I wasn't theorizing. I was just observing people.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are going to bring our first hour to a close, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about your work. We're going to talk more about the music. Sure. Because your work actually deals directly with the music, and we're going to let folks in the audience get some too.
Oh, good.
All right. So let's give our guest a hand. Okay. All right. Part two. I want to start off by asking you to speak about women writers, even feminist literature. We haven't said anything about that trajectory specifically. Right. So, I mean, tell us about that.
Yeah, so I came to the male writers first. They were in my house, and the people who I was exposed to first. Toni Morrison was one of the first women writers that I started reading, although I did get a book called The Black Woman that was edited by Toni Cade. And it had all these stories and poems and essays in it. And I remember that being very important to me as a little girl, even when I didn't really understand everything that was in it. Just the object was significant. And I begged my father to buy me that book. We were in a bookstore, and he said, well, why do you want it? And it was because it had this pretty black lady on the cover with an afro. But I knew that wasn't going to be good enough. So I told him, I said, it has something by Abby in there, and it has something by Nikki Giovanni. And he made a bargain with me. He said, if you memorize one of the poems, then you can have it, And so and he would reward me for things like that with shoes. I have a shoe fetish until today, because he would buy me shoes if I did that kind of thing.
Okay.
So then when I was in college is really when the women writers sort of started just shaping the way I thought about everything. Audre Lorde and Alice Walker was beginning to be big. The Color Purple was just about to come out. And luckily I got a chance to meet all of these people as a college student. My professor, Nathan Huggins, they would come through and he'd be invited to something, and he would sometimes say, I can't go to this, why don't you go? And so, not meet them in a way that they would remember me or know me or anything, but just be in the same room with them. And the two who were Gloria Naylor published The Women of Brewster Place at the time. And again, you know, just this sense, I mean, I think very different from my mother's generation or even my sister, this sense that writing beautiful literature was something black women did, right? Because they were. And at that time, I think Toni was always important to me. She would reemerge as sort of the major figure, but Alice Walker was very significant because she wrote essays, and I always was kind of looking for a form. And I used to write poetry. I wasn't very good at that, but I wrote short stories, and but it was this, and I tried to be a journalist. I tried to write for the Harvard Crimson, and then in the summer I would write for newspapers. But the essay as a form is the form that really captured me. And Alice Walker was writing those, and James Baldwin is, I think, the best essayist our country has produced. So, but the women writers became very important to me later on as a young woman, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll just let you, I was going to say other than Toni, but who was most significant for you and why amongst the women writers?
Well, Morrison.
Okay.
Yeah. Although, you know, Toni K. Bambara, very important to me because she was, and the reason why is that she was a great writer. She's funny, very political. She wrote about little girls in Harlem, and the experience that she wrote about was something that was familiar to me, being a little girl and hanging out in the street and jumping double dutch, but having this sort of, you know, a kind of sophistication that you have to have growing up in the city. So I loved her for that. But Toni Morrison literally was like my Bible. Yeah, I think the particularly Song of Solomon and later Beloved. Yeah.
What is it about her and what is it about those books that are so important for you and to you?
Well, at first it was familiarity. It was, you know, so I'd had this kind of high literary training about what was proper for literature, what forms, what was heroic. And she took a little black girl who was considered ugly because she was dark, which was, you know, I understood that. I knew that people thought dark-skinned girls were ugly, but in my family, I was told that, you know, I was a little queen, so it was like it was a disconnect for me. But she really made that real, you know, this little girl, Piccola in The Bluest Eye. She's the first person who put women like my aunts in fiction, women who use Dixie Peach hair grease, you know, in fiction, and wrote about them just in these really poetic ways. And there would be times when I'd be reading Toni Morrison on the bus, and there are a few writers that do this to me. I would have to get off the bus and read it out loud so I could hear it, because I was like, this part of the writing wants to be heard. I need to hear this. And so I would like get off 2 blocks ahead of home and read it out loud to myself so that I could hear it. And she's one of the few writers who do that for me. Ellison does that too. And then, you know, the way that she just raised our experience and our history to this really high level, you know, and she would give names to things that had happened in our history, that just made them these things of sort of world historic importance. And yet and still, the people in her books were familiar. They were, you know, like I knew people like that. I knew Shadrach, who's the crazy veteran in Sula. I knew people in my neighborhood like that. I mean, our neighborhoods used to always have people who now I know, oh, they were probably paranoid schizophrenic, you know, or he probably suffered from bipolar disorder. But we didn't know that then. I mean, some people thought, you know, he was possessed by the devil, and some people thought he went off to white people's college and came back crazy, and some people thought he had a bad drug trip.
Right.
You know, and just the way she took figures that I knew every day and just made their lives so poetic. And then something like Beloved, really, I started Beloved 3 times and I couldn't get through it. I was like, I don't know what she's talking about. I can't do this. And then I remember one Christmas Eve, I was home from school, and I sat in my mother's living room. She went to bed, and I started reading it, and I read through till the sun came up. You know, it was like all of a sudden, this book that I could not read through 3 pages, I could read the whole thing. And Beloved was just, you know, I mean, it gave this sense of understanding to slavery that no history book I had ever read had given.
What is it about fiction that allows it to actually, in many cases, reach deeper dimensions of our human experience than history? Especially since you were talking about coming, you know, you did fiction, you did literature and history. What is it about literature that does that?
I think that, you know, it's the imagination, that there are people who are, no matter how hard you try, and we've learned more as historians how to do this, how to get to those untold stories, and how to tell the stories of people who didn't leave archives and things like that. We've gotten so much better at doing that. But let's take the archive. Say you're in the archive and you have you find a record from a company that owned slave ships, and you find the captain's diary, and the captain in his diary can say, so and so, age 7, you know, died today. So little whatever, and we know this is a little African girl. And we can do whatever we can to try and find out who she was. You know, for the most part, most historians for a long time didn't care who she was. You know, and maybe she was number 154 out of a ship that had 500 people. But now we can find out something about her. Well, this ship came from this part of Africa, so maybe she was from here, and maybe she wore these kind of waist beads. But if you're a writer of fiction, and you're a good writer of fiction, you're interested in that scrap. And the fact that we don't have that history then allows for us to imagine who she was and to give her a sense of humanity. And it's not stuff that they're just only making up out of their heads. Toni does as much research as any historian. So she's going to go back and find out what was a little girl's life in that village like. And then she's going to give her to us, and she's going to give her a name. I don't know. I've seen my friend Deirdre here. She might name her Deirdre. And from now on, in my life, that little girl is not going to be number 154. She's going to be Deirdre, this little girl with a name and a family, and who, you know, liked butterflies or something. I don't know. So that's what fiction can do. And what I loved about Morrison was just her audacity, and like her latest book. She's just turned 80 years old. I hope I'm still writing when I'm 80. But she decided, she's already kind of gone back and imagined this slave past. Now she's looking at this country that we call the United States of America, and she's saying, how did this country get to be the way it is? And she decides she's going to go back and write a novel about this place that we call the United States before it became the United States, and show us how it didn't have to go the way it went. Right? Historians can do that, but I think that artists can give us our humanity, you know, through characters that are imagined. And academics aren't supposed to say this, but, you know, I'm getting to the point where I don't really care about what I'm supposed to say as an academic. I also think it's a very spiritual process. You know, like there's little room in academia to talk about that process. But I think it's very spiritual. I mean, I think that there are these stories and histories and voices that want to be known. And they you know, they make themselves available, and people who are attuned to them are able to tell them.
You know, it's interesting that you said that, because when I think about Morrison's work, one of the images that comes to me is she allows the dead, the ancestors, to speak.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, that's kind of like the spirit of what I feel about Toni Morrison.
And even in places where she says we don't have the language to talk about this, right? So what she'll do is she'll let the language break down. You know, she tries to give us those bodies in the middle passage on the bottom of that ship, and she's like, I don't even have the language to describe this. And so the language in this part of the book is not going to be easy. You know, we shouldn't have easy access to that experience to make it a cliche. But I think that great writers, like great musicians, or just in general, people in general, this is what I think this about the improvising musician too.
Okay.
That you practice and practice and practice, and you get your chops ready, and you know what you have to know, and you do the scales, and and if you're a writer, you read the history and you read the great writers, and it's work and it's discipline. And then because of that, you're ready. When the moment comes, you have the capacity to express that moment of inspiration. Like, you know, it's not that that's not a moment of inspiration and something magical happens, but in order to be chosen by the magic, you have to be prepared for it. And so it's one of those ways that I think that writers are similar. That, you know, they've done their work, they've done their research, they've learned how to write a sentence, so that when that voice comes, wherever it comes from, in our heads or wherever, you have to be ready to really give it the sentence that it deserves. Yeah.
Okay. Now let's speak about some of the sentences you wrote in your Be Free, Be a Mystery in
Yeah.
Search of Billie Holiday. Tell us about that book and when it was. And I also want to get your career trajectory. So like when you got your PhD, where did you teach?
Okay, so I started teaching before I got my PhD. I taught like semester here, semester there. I taught at Sarah Lawrence for a little while. I taught at Trinity College. But my first full-time job was back in Philly. I wanted to go back home. It was at University of Pennsylvania. I turned my dissertation into the book. That's the Who Set You Flowing book. I did some more historical kind of research, archival research books there. And then I just decided if I could write about anything I wanted to write about, I would write about Billie Holiday. But I knew that Bob O'Meally had written the most beautiful Billie Holiday book. He wrote the book I wanted to write. You know, I mean, I read it and I loved it, but I also cried because I was like, well, now what am I going to do? And so then I thought about the ways I had learned to think about her versus what I was hearing on the record. That I was hearing one thing on the record, but I had this other set of all of this stuff that seemed sometimes to cohere with the record, but a lot of times not to, and didn't seem to be as complex as the record, what I heard on the record. And my father loved her, so I think it was also a book trying to get to what my daddy knew, right? And so I just decided that I'm going to write this book about Billie Holiday, and I'm going to write it in the form that it comes to me. There might not be a model form out there. And so that's what I did. Yeah, that's what I did. And it ended up being less of a biography and more, like I often think of it as a biography of the versions of Billie Holiday that we get, like the version of Billie Holiday that we get out of the movies, and the version that we get out of books, and the version that gets sold to us versus what I thought I was hearing on the records.
And how would you describe what you were hearing on the records, and through your research and the writing and completion of the book, can you, and it's difficult, but can you sum up the reality of what you felt from Billie as opposed to the projected persona and the stereotypes and all of that?
Yeah. Well, I had to know that I also had my own projections. You know, like I first came to Billie Holiday, I realize now, out of an act of mourning. Like, so my father died when I was 9. And at the same time, the movie Lady Sings the Blues came out. I wasn't allowed to go see it. I didn't go see the movie, but because of that, she was kind of everywhere. And so there were books about her and pictures of her and Ebony magazine articles. And the first albums that started getting re-released were actually really old material. I mean, like, not old, were material from the latter part of her life.
Right.
And so I think initially what I heard in Billie Holiday was, you know, she didn't, at first I was like, why is she a great singer? Because I'm used to hearing, my mother loved Gladys Knight.
Right.
And at that time, Gladys Knight was coming out with a hit song every other week. You know,
Right.
Neither One of Us and all of these songs.
Or Aretha.
Aretha.
Right.
Those, so I was like, that's a voice, Aretha.
Right.
You know, Gladys Knight and Billie Holiday don't sound like that. And yet she seemed to really capture my something emotionally for me. And I think initially what I heard in her was a kind of a feeling of loss. Like, you know, that I would listen to her and I could feel, I was allowed to experience this feeling of loss. in the beginning. And then later on, what I heard was this person who had this really little range, but did these like incredible, magnificent things within that range. And this is before I even knew formally what was happening musically. I just knew that she was able to do stuff. And then at different stages in my life, whatever stage I was in my life, I found a Billie Holiday to meet that stage. So my first major heartbreaks, you know, your first heartbreaks are the worst. Because like your third heartbreak, you know you had one before and you're going to get over it, even though it's hard. But the first heartbreak, you just are like, oh my God. And so there's a Billie Holiday for that heartbreak, you know. And I heard her there too. But then what I realized was that, one, she changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
So like there were times there was a kind of young, flirtatious, them, their eyes, or early recording. And I was like, oh God, I want to look like she sounds, you know, just something so like spring in her voice and fun and swinging. And then later on, something very mournful in that same tune, you know. So it was about listening to people at different stages in their lives, or what they wanted to get across. And I think I started becoming aware just of her artistry, you know, and that just because she did it on record didn't mean that she was singing about her life.
Right.
Because any one night, when I started listening to the live records, she could be tragic, down in the dumps, Billie Holiday one minute, and that flirty, you know, fine and mellow Billie Holiday the next. And so I think everything just kept saying, just listen. Like Abby has that song, Learning How to Listen. Just listen and trust your ear, you know.
Okay. You mentioned Miles earlier as being who captured you.
Yeah.
Okay. And we have Billie. Now, both of them are examples of artists who we can clearly say that in terms of the range of their particular instrument that they played, whereas if the range is here,
Right.
they played here.
Exactly.
How would you connect those two based on those limitations?
Well, I think that's without knowing it, that's what I was learning from them, you know. And it came in handy. Like I said, I mean, some of you don't know Fred Moten, but I went to college with Fred Moten, who's a genius.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I thought, oh my God, I remember he was a poet, and I was like, if Fred writes poetry, I can't write poetry. But then I was like, yes, you can. You know, because first of all, nobody can write what you write. And yeah, there are these people who have these enormous capacities and these very wide range, right? And, you know, we love them. They're virtuosic. And then there are these people who do so much within the range that they have, and it's so soulful.
Right.
So I think that was it. I think Miles sounds a lot like Lady. And he sounds a lot like Shirley Horn, or Shirley Horn sounds like him. Of a lot of the instrumentalists, he sounded like women singers who I loved. Just kind of, you know, just this kind of softness, this beauty, silence, that I felt like I was hearing something along the same continuum.
Right. Okay. And the career, the trajectory. All right. So, let me see. You mentioned Sarah Lawrence. You went back to Philly. Now, where were you teaching in Philly?
Where?
Yeah.
At the University of Pennsylvania. So I moved back to Philly,
Right.
and you know my family was still there, and I started teaching at Penn. Houston Baker was my senior colleague at the time.
Would this have been the late 90s?
This was early 90s, so
Early
this was like
90s,
94, something like that, 94, 93, 94.
Okay.
So Who Set You Flowing came out in 95.
Oh, okay. Okay. And then after UPenn,
So while I was at UPenn, and I started working on a Billie Holiday book, I was invited by Bob O'Mealy to start coming up for jazz study group meetings.
right, like around 96?
Around 96.
Yeah.
And that was really life-changing for me, because here were these like-minded people who, again, sort of said, you know, there are these ways of writing about the music, and you don't have to write like that. You know, we were interested in what you have to say. And there, you know, it would be a room full of people who I'd read, and graduate students who were going to become people who I was going to be reading, and it was scholars and writers and musicians and journalists and filmmakers and artists, and it was just so much energy, you know. and they were all my teachers. They were all my teachers. And so I started coming up for that, and then I came up, and I think I taught a course once a week. When Bob was on leave, I taught one of his courses. And then the other thing, so Columbia was attractive because Bob was just starting to create this sort of scene around jazz studies. At the same time, Manning Marable was creating African American studies, and I sort of had these. Like Manning didn't know anything about the stuff I wrote about literature and music. He knew me through my activism.
Wow.
So he knew me, through some political stuff, like some anti-death penalty work and stuff like that. And so, and stuff that I wrote along those lines, and the more historical things that I wrote. I was writing, I wrote some essays on Malcolm and things like that. And so he knew me through that, and they kind of came together and created this place for me to come to Columbia.
Okay. I won't go into this, but I was at NYU at a time when Trisha Rose was there.
Right.
And let me just say for the record, they were fools.
Yeah, to let her go.
Yeah, and weren't you also up for possible?
I did. I actually got a job offer from NYU at the time.
You did get the offer?
Yeah, I did get the offer, but they didn't offer me tenure. And I didn't have tenure yet. But
that was the issue.
Yeah, they made me an offer, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't going to move without tenure.
Okay.
So, and I knew, it was one of those things where, I really wanted to come to New York. And at that time, it really didn't matter to me which institution I came. The goal was to be in New York and be close to the music. And so I had a feeling, I was like, something else will open up for me when I'm ready. So I stayed at Penn, which was a very good place, very supportive place, and got tenure there, and then I came to Columbia.
Okay, all right. Now, Clawing at the Limits of Cool. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and the greatest jazz collaboration ever.
Yeah, hyperbole, but.
Farah Jasmine Griffin and Salim Washington. Tell us here and us there, about this work.
So first, I'll tell you a little bit about the title.
Okay.
So we don't take credit for the second half of the title, the greatest jazz collaboration ever. Marketers decide on titles. So they said, we want this book to be called Have the Greatest Jazz Collaboration Ever, and we thought about all our critics, and we said, people are going to say, well, what about Ellington and Strayhorn, and what about Max Roach and Clifford Brown? There's lots of collaborations. We're not saying it's the greatest. It's an important one. But we decided that they could have this subtitle if they gave us the title. And the title actually comes from a Amiri Baraka poem about train. Amtrak, some of you might know that poem, and he says, train clawed at the limits of cool. And that just seemed to capture what we were trying to say. So that's the title. The book did not generate with me. I had already started another project. I'd finished Billie Holiday. I started another project. Salim is a very dear friend, and I should say a teacher as well about the music. And
he's also not only a scholar,
scholar, player, right, composer. So he had been approached. I actually think Robin Kelly, who wrote the biography of Monk, beautiful biography of Monk, might have given this editor Salim's name. And he approached Salim about writing a book about Miles and Train, and he was only interested in the Prestige recordings. And Salim said that he would do it if I could do it with him, because we had this ongoing conversation. He had a kind of conversion moment in his life listening to Train, and loves Train, and I loved Miles. And so these conversations that we've been having for years, it was like, wouldn't it be interesting to try to work through some of those together? So the publisher agreed. The book did not turn out in the way I think they wanted it. I think it's funny, I don't know if you remember, but this was during a period when there was a show at the MoMA, I think. Which museum had moved from Midtown and was out in Queens?
In Queens.
MoMA.
Right.
So they had a big Picasso Matisse exhibition, which was wonderful. Really wonderful exhibition.
Yeah.
But I think the editor was thinking about that friendship, that competitive friendship. So he said, I want this book on Miles and Train. And, he had this image of them kind of battling it out, very kind of masculinist, fighting, boxing image. And we were like, it was never like that.
Right.
First of all, Train wasn't there yet when Miles got him. It just wasn't like that. So we decided not to just do the prestige recordings, and that it wasn't going to be a book about these two giants fighting each other every night, but really about something else. And so they agreed. I mean, they gave us, they let us go ahead and do what we wanted to do. And basically, we divided it up in the beginning where I did most of the kind of social and cultural history part, and Salim did all of the musical analysis, and he picked all the musical selections. But we shared that with each other. And then after a while, we both, we were able to both kind of switch off, and then come together and try to make it seamless.
Okay.
And that's what we got.
And what would you say about that collaboration? What made that Miles Davis John Coltrane collaboration so special? What did you went in knowing certain things, you went in feeling certain things. What did you discover?
I think a few things. One, Miles's eye and ear for talent, and his a kind of generosity and allowing that talent to do what they did and grow in spite of critics telling him you really need to get rid of him. Allowing him to do it. His willingness, his need to kind of put his foot down when necessary, when he wanted to make it more commercially, and it seemed like the people with him weren't really helping to contribute to that project. His willingness to let people go, but also to bring them back. And Train's incredible growth, his discipline and his growth. And I think, to me, I knew less about Train going into the project, but to me, it's Train's story that's really the drama that unfolds the book, because we see him kind of just working, trying to get there, and trying to figure things out, and then having this moment where he frees himself of drug addiction, and he keeps practicing, and he's not with Miles, but he hooks up with Monk, who's a completely different kind of teacher and mentor, and by the time he comes back, there's no containing him. Like, he's not going to be able to be in Miles's band or anybody's band. So, while the Miles story is there, and it's a beautiful story, the drama of that period, I think, is really following Train's narrative. And the way we try to show it in the book is that the first few chapters start out with Miles, and then there's an interlude, and then the last chapters start out with Train, because he sort of moved on. So I think that's what I learned. And then the other thing I learned was just kind of about their common histories, the similarities and the differences, that they both came from a generation of black people who were kind of that first generation that was free, that built institutions, that dealt with Jim Crow, that dealt with the violence, racial violence, but really instilled the kind of confidence in their young people. That Miles was dominated more by his patrilineal lineage,
Right.
and Trained by the women in his family. And so, I mean, there were just those kinds of things that I did not know as much about. Yeah. And again, it was one of those things where, what can we say that's new? Because like Lady Day, these people have been written about so much.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. So I think, I have other questions, but I think I'm going to open it up. I gave you my word. Didn't I tell you?
Yes.
Did I tell you?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to open it up and let you all weigh in and ask some questions, make some comments. I know there are friends and students and other folks here. So now's your turn. Raise your hand. Yes.
Well, I have 3 questions. Is that it? Since no one else raised their hand?
Share
Raise
one.
your hand.
I'll take one. Deirdre Kelly, you got 3 questions?
I have about 3 or 4 questions,
Wow.
and I know
Can
this
we
lady really well.
do 2? Go to other folks?
I'll just do one. I'll do one.
All right.
I'll do one.
All right.
Farah, I've known you for a long time,
long
and it's
time.
always wonderful to hear you speak and to read your work. But the thing that strikes me, and maybe this is because of my child, is the incredible sort of accomplishments and your trajectory. And when you were talking about, going to Harvard and picking it just sort of because of Harvard Square, and without this pressure that so many young people have now about like going to a Harvard, and if you get in, that's where you're going because it's Harvard and you got in, and then to be able to pick a major like history and writing. I mean, Eliza is picked literature, write English, and everybody was like, she's not going to make any money. So you hear that kind of thing, and I'm wondering if, it just seems like you were straight ahead. I know your mother, and I know that she encouraged you, but what else could you say about that kind of tenacity that you seem to have in order to make it in those institutions too?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that partly for me it was ignorance, like just, I had absolutely no pressure, like in terms of what to major in or even where to go to school. Like the pressure was, you are going to school, right? That the family told me, that we have a lot of really smart people in our family, but they haven't all had the opportunities that you've had. So you are going to school. And there were two requirements. You're not going to have a baby. That's not allowed. Eventually, but not before you finish school. And you are going somewhere. And I think they all thought probably that because I was so close to my mother, I think people were shocked that I left. So everybody thought that I'd go to Temple or University of Pennsylvania. But other than that, there was no pressure. There wasn't like, oh, you have to go to this kind of school, because they really didn't know. Harvard and Yale, they heard on Beverly Hillbillies, like so they had a sense of it, but there was no pressure that you had to go there. I felt after I got in, like, I have to go here. But I didn't have any pressure about, you've got to make this kind of money. There was a sense that whatever I did, I was going to be okay, and probably do better than many people. So I think that if I'd had a lot of the choices I made, I just made because I didn't know that you should be making choices you should be making major choices that related to a job. I just didn't have that sense. And when I look back on it, it doesn't feel like tenacity. It actually feels like all the things that I didn't know actually freed me to make some choices. My ignorance freed me. And now I look back and think, oh my goodness.
So in a sense, in a way, ignorance was bliss.
It was. In a lot of ways it was. And my mother and I still talk about it. She'll say, how did we do that? How did we, and who did we think we were? We very much saw ourselves as a team. But I think a lot of it we didn't know. And then there were I had these angels who came into my life. Like I talked about working for Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, a really important judge in Philly, who took me under his wing because he grew up similarly to the way I did. Or public school teachers. I'm so angry now about the way public school teachers are being talked about so badly because, I had incredible teachers from my little neighborhood, little black school, all the way through, even before I got to private school, who would tell my mother, these opportunities are available for her. But a lot of it we just didn't know. And so path opened up, you follow it. And it was this feeling like I always knew I could go home if it didn't work. So, yeah.
All right, can I ask my other question? She's sort of leading. She's sort of leading to my section.
That's interesting.
That's a very interesting. Yes, you may.
Okay, good.
Yes, you may.
So, again, I know a lot about you, and I know that you have many, many talents. Just as a fantasy, it seems like you could have been a historian, you could have been a writer, a fictional writer, you could have done you could have been a musician maybe.
Yeah.
If you were just gonna fantasize, like someone gave you, I don't know, a year to just pursue something very different from what you do, what would that be?
Wow. I don't want to leave this audience thinking that I could have been a musician.
Truly, you could have pursued that.
I could have pursued it. I would have been okay, right? If I could have, and the one thing that I cannot do that I would have given anything in the world to do is sing. I cannot sing. I mean, I remember making up the bed singing some Aretha song when I was like 12, and my Aunt Eartha said, "Oh, my family calls me Jazzy. Oh, Jazzy, please, like, just don't do it." So, so if I could sing, that's what I would have done. But there was never any, that would have been pure fantasy. There was never any sense that I could do that. The other thing is I probably would have written fiction, published fiction. I mean, I continued to write fiction, but I never pursued it, really. And so the impossible thing, in the universe where the impossible is possible, I would sing. But I probably would have pursued writing fiction more. Yeah, I see a hand way back there. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, man.
Maybe you can't sing, but to focus on Duke Ellington, you never let a song go out of your heart. So, anyway, one of the things that I really admire about you is you've captured something in reporting or writing about the musicians that is rarely ever focused on. It's always the range or limitations or the personal life. Mm-hmm. And there's, on page 3 of your book and page 13, captures something that is unique to you, and I want you to say why you're doing this and the absence of it with other reportings on jazz. Mm-hmm. And it's you said Miles' public persona, among other things, expresses the confidence and hipness that became so important to American masculinity, and did so in a way that was genuinely cool, virtually free of the prejudice, or predictable, of affectations of pretenders. Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned, and I'm saying this because I'm coming to the Jazz Museum, and they're talking about the music, and I'm looking at the way Coleman Hawkins is dressed, the way Dizzy is dressed, the way Miles holds his horn. Everyone had a style. Right. You said they did it well, and they also did it with style. Mm-hmm. You seem to understand that this style is representative of not only these individual musicians, but of the community as a whole. Right. On page 13, you says, for Miles, the music is the central component of a larger aesthetic project that includes fashion, painting, boxing, and self-creation. So,
thank you for reading so closely.
That's
Thank you.
so unique and so outstanding and so very much you, and you're very much appreciated for just being.
Thank you. I think that, and I want to give Salim credit about that too, because that's something we talked about a lot. I think part of that comes from also coming from the culture, and realizing that, and I think you brought this up too in terms of like music not being separated into genre, that these things weren't separated, right? That one style was about how you looked, how you dressed, how you played the music, whatever. Like you said, how you hold your instrument. You look at any photograph of Lester Young and the way he holds his horn. I mean, it's just very much a part of that individuality. So I think part of it was being immersed in that culture and realizing what was important, and really not parsing out how somebody plays a particular note from their self-presentation and their sense of self, and also knowing that, and I guess now it's similar with a generation coming of age in the hip hop era, that for my father and his friends, those who went on to become musicians were also, they were sort of models of a certain kind of black masculinity. You dress like they did, you talk like they did, you carried yourself with a level of sophistication like they did. I mean, even in terms of, not just the musicians, but what people were reading, what they were looking at. Did someone decide to take up boxing? Boxing because and for them it was somebody like Sugar Ray Robinson, right? That's the boxer who they identified with. So, right, style. So that it was all of a part. And again, I talked at the beginning about the different members of my family who I associated with specific musics. I also associate them with specific foods, specific ways of dressing, that a whole aesthetic, and that there was no separation really between them. Yeah.
Going back to migration in Philadelphia.
Right.
Did the people who migrated from the South, did the people who came to Philadelphia, were they from a particular area of the South?
Yeah.
You know, was there like a group that was just like, they just moved up to Philadelphia, and maybe another group went to Georgia,
Right.
went to Detroit,
Absolutely.
and maybe others went to Chicago.
Absolutely. So, you know, the Chicago-Detroit trajectory is mostly Mississippi, Alabama. Philly was Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, East Georgia. But I didn't even know about Virginia as much. I knew everybody I knew was from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Their family. My husband's family is from Farmville, Virginia, and what I didn't know is that early migration that Du Bois talks about in the Philadelphia Negro, and this is before the Great Migration, that early migration, many of them came from Farmville, actually. So I had no idea, and it probably was, you know, sometimes it was train lines, sometimes it was particular industries or farms or whatever in Jersey in particular. But everybody I knew, their family came from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Yeah. No, I did not know anybody whose family came from Mississippi until I left Philadelphia.
I promised in our Facebook messaging each other that I would ask you about a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Do you remember the writer's name?
Yeah, it's Kenneth Warren. He's a professor at University of Chicago.
Thank you. He has a book, which I guess this article is based on,
Right.
where he claims that African American literature is no longer. And his basic idea or thesis was that the literature is connected to Jim Crow.
Right.
And since we are no longer in Jim Crow, I mean, he didn't say we're post-racial.
Right.
thank
No,
goodness.
he didn't say that.
But since and that's inextricably tied to it based on what he's saying, it's no longer in existence because we're not in that
Right.
era anymore. What would you say about that? You know,
Yeah.
being a expert and a specialist in that area. What
Yeah.
would you say?
I've been thinking through it because I actually have been asked to be one of a number of critics who responds to the book. In the Los Angeles Times is starting their book review again, so I haven't said anything because I haven't formed my ideas yet.
And what's the for the record?
Yeah.
What's the title?
The title of the book, I think, is "What Happened to African American Literature" or something like that. And so it's provocative, and he says that there is no such thing as African American literature anymore. But he does say that it's still something that people should study, but that no writer writing today is going to be writing African American literature. So it's a very long, complicated argument. But what I'll say is that I think that he's both right and wrong, and he's right in that he's talking about a particular strand of African American literature, a strand of African American literature that we call protest literature, that's responding, to those issues that he responds. And if you even look at where he starts, I mean, he starts like in the 1890s or so, which means if you start there, then you aren't talking about, or even maybe a little earlier, but he's not talking about Wheatley, he's not talking about David Walker. So I do think that we are over a period in the literature, which was protest literature, and people like Baldwin and Ellison were saying that we should have been over that a long time ago. But I don't think that, I think that he's done exactly what he wanted to do. He's got us sitting in here tonight talking about this. It's a very provocative way to talk about the literature. So we're going through a period of transformation, but I don't think a period where we can say there is no such thing as African American literature being produced anymore.
And speaking of transformation, you work with young people all the time, and we are in the era, the hip hop era. And I've got to admit that, and we're pretty much the same generation. I got to admit that I feel like listening to some Billie Holiday because I feel a sense of loss. The R&B that we would hear in the 70s, Earth, Wind and Fire, Spinners, and there's a certain type of soulfulness to Philadelphia sound, let alone jazz.
Right.
That I don't feel, and I'm not trying to dump on hip hop, but I don't feel it, and it just seems like that generation, and my daughter's of the generation, unless like my daughter, she's eclectic in her musical taste. She's been exposed to. Seems like that there's certain aspects of this cultural complex, this cultural continuum that we're talking about, the Afro-American cultural continuum, that, you know, of style, of elegance, and I don't want to believe we've lost it.
Right.
But what would you say, based on where you are and working with the young people that you work with?
Yeah, I guess I don't. Well, one, I think that, you know, our styles have always been innovative and on the cutting edge and constantly changing, and that you know, our genius comes through. Like, not everything that was produced in the R&B, classic R&B, was, you know, genius work. Some of it was silly, and so, you know, I think I always remind students they don't believe this, because, you know, my only problem with the students who claim hip hop as their culture is that they really don't believe anybody ever thought anything before they did it, you know. But I don't disassociate, you know. I mean, I recognize the genius in what they have produced, and I have to remind them sometimes that it's actually my generation that created hip hop. So, you know, and I know that we're all like old now, but the form itself comes of age. But to them, the form itself comes of age with us. So, I mean, I think that there's, you know, some really provocative, beautiful work being produced. It's not the work that we get to hear on the radio. It's not the work that's commercial. One of the things that I think is also painful, and I don't blame this on the artists so much, there's some really talented people out there who just have really bad material. You know, there's a young woman out of Philly, who those of you who listen to contemporary R&B might know, named Jasmine Sullivan. She's got an incredible voice.
Yes,
I just posted something.
Yes, she does.
I posted a clip of her on my Facebook page when she was 11 years old, singing Home. Yeah.
And I wrote, Lord have mercy.
Exactly. I mean, so, you know, so the voices are still there. I think
what
that
you going to say about her, the material?
well, the material, like the marketing and the material, if they, you know, want to gain a popular hearing, I think, you know, that's where the challenges are, but not in terms of the talent and even the desire and the artistry that's there. And Philly is an interesting place. I mean, I might write something on Philly soon, but it's interesting because, you know, Jill Scott comes out of Philly, and the Roots come out of Philly. And so
Christian McBride
comes out of Philly, right? And again, it's across genre, and there are these young artists who have been talking to each other and in school with each other. So I'm less pessimistic about the contemporary moment, because I always know there's more going on than what we get fed through, you know, the mediums that feed us, tell us what's popular and what's right.
Yeah, there's no question. The talent's there. I mean, you know, but I'll leave that there.
Okay.
Another question.
Yeah.
I would submit that hip hop has died when Tupac and Biggie were killed, and it was in an afterglow until about 2000, and then it was done. So to call this the hip hop generation is really rather erroneous, because the generation is embraces the original masters and then the people who succeeded before it was co-opted completely by the music industrial complex. That said, and this is not a musical...
Imani Wilson, brilliant person in the audience, right?
This is not a musical time in general. We're shut off sound-wise from one another. We don't live in an acoustic world where we encounter music in the main, in our lives daily. You have the music that you put into your life, but very little enters otherwise. You don't pass and hear instruments in your daily walk. So if this is not a musical time, what is the most interesting art to you that's being produced now? Where if you had to tell a 5-year-old what to go and see or hear or do or look at, that you think would be interesting to them over a lifetime, what
That's a fascinating question.
Form of art would
it's really
you be
fascinating. I mean, I want to comment on what you said before. I was in Cuba in 2001, and I was struck. I mean, I don't think I realized how much I didn't hear music outside until I was in Cuba, and I heard music everywhere. And you know, I heard every child practicing an instrument, and then there was the radio, and I mean, it was just so musical. But I just feel like that we have to listen in different places for the music, and it might not sound like what we would call music, but somewhere, you know, in our communities, I think music is being produced, whether it's in verbally or whatever. I'm fascinated by the visual, and I think that we are going to have, largely because of technology, we're going to have more and more young people whose creative expression is going to begin to come out visually. You know, the ways and the films they see, the videos they see, the images that they see all around them. I think that that's going to be we always have this extraordinary tradition of the visual arts, but I think something really fascinating is going to happen with young people who are so inundated with visual stimuli. So that's where I would have my eye. And then they always surprise me. You know, I don't think we're going to lose the poetics. You know, I just hope that I'm capable of hearing it as it comes. So, and it doesn't sound like noise to me, right? Yeah.
Well, we're going to round out. That's going to be our final comment.
Oh,
I would like,
okay.
well, okay, make it very quick. Make it very quick.
If you have not seen or listened to the Lupe Fiasco, Kanye
Right.
Most Def, Robert Gladys
Yeah.
concert that just went down in the Blue Note, and can't say
Yeah.
that jazz and hip hop
Right.
are not both alive and quite well, you're missing out on an opportunity. You can't be a jazz fan and not say that you're a hip hop fan, because hip hop is jazz crack's baby, and so that's just the way that it is. And so, I mean, these traditions are very much linked and very much continue to be linked. And there are people that are in the culture. They may not be on MTV. They may
Exactly.
not be winning Grammys, even though Esperanza Spalding just got broken off.
Right.
But there are people that are out here that are pushing this tradition in a very rich way.
Yep.
And there are also artists who are commercially viable who also understand what's going on in that culture. And we need to kind of support and understand that.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to end. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the Robert Glasper piece, because, you know, you're exactly right. I mean, and that's what I mean by, I just try not to have a sense of pessimism about our music and our culture, and that if we don't hear it, doesn't mean that it's not happening. And my question is usually, where is it happening, and what am I missing out on, right? And so thank
The
you.
beauty of technology is that we can now hear that somebody had a cell phone video somewhere taking a picture or
Right.
recording that sound, and that's the beauty of the age that we're living in now. So many, you know, we're here in the Jazz Museum of Harlem, we have these Savoy records that are lost, and that there's just this little bit that we don't have, and we're living in an age now where anyone can record anything that's going on anywhere, and that stuff can live on forever.
And the other thing, I'll close with this too. You know, I don't know how many of you saw a film about 5 years ago, a film called Rise, about dancers in LA. And that answered a question for me, because I always wondered, I mean, it was like in the absolute absence of where everything has been taken away, you know, this is a tradition that finds a way to create and uses whatever is there, even if it's the most horrific things, to create something artistic and transcendent out of it. So I think that's just in alignment with what you've been saying.
But
Thank
before
you.
you end,
Yeah.
We only have,
could you say a little bit about your future project?
yes,
Because
please.
it involves
Yeah. So I just finished a draft of a book that is really a draft about 4 women who were in Harlem in the 1940s. Pearl Primus, the dancer, Mary Lou Williams, the pianist and composer, Ann Petrie, the writer, and a white woman named Alice Neal, who lived in East Harlem from 1938 until 1970 something, and painted El Barrio before the journalists realized that El Barrio was happening. So those 4 women are the latest project. Yeah, thank you.
And on that note, thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful.